Okay, everybody, we are going to get started again with our first afternoon session. So this is beginning to pull out of some conservation weeds and back into some larger systemic discussions about conservation and how it gets done and what impact it has. Our panel now is going to be on a particular construct within the broad field of philanthropy called trust-based philanthropy and the context in which it resides. And Sebastian Africano is going to be moderating a panel with our friends Lisa and Ross, who Sebastian will introduce properly now. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Sebastian Africano. I'm the Executive Director of Trees, Water, and People in Fort Collins, Colorado. And happy to introduce Lisa Jaguzny and Ross Jameson, both from philanthropy and foundations. Ross is with the Sitka Foundation, and Lisa is the Director of Programs and Initiatives with the Biodiversity Funders Group. So the topic of the day is shifting the paradigm. There's a lot of conversation about the federal withdrawal of funding this type of work. Trees, Water, and People works at kind of the intersection of communities and conservation. We're largely a social science organization, and we look at conservation through a lens of livelihoods and community well-being, and also through the lens of strong organizations and building influential organizations on the ground. So we're very grassroots. We're very, heard a lot about, I took so many notes. So I had a script worked out in my head that I, worked out in my sleep. And then after all the content today, I've just been taking notes. Oh, I should work that in somehow. Oh, I should play off that somehow. So it's going to be a scramble, and we'll see what comes out. But integrated conservation, Dallas this morning talked about social and biocultural economies and livelihoods. That really resonated with me. Integrating and connecting the work in synergistic ways. I think Tad mentioned that this morning. The urgency between the scale and depth of the challenges we're working on, and at the same time wanting to work at the speed of trust and relationships. That resonated a lot with me this morning with Jen and Brian. Cutting bureaucratic red tape to accelerate while not disregarding inclusivity and consultation. I thought that was really important as well. So all of these themes just keep coming up. It comes back to people and the people that are doing the work, the people, Angela's comment on, it's the people on the ground that really need to be making the decisions. That's where conservation happens, and that's how we approach the work. And this happened for us, Trees, Water, People's a small nonprofit. We've been around 27 years. I've been around 20 of those 27 years. And we work on the tail of Turtle Island. We work in Central America. And also all the way up through Mexico and into tribal lands in the U.S. So we work in New Mexico, Colorado, South Dakota. And in Central America in 2020, we all had the COVID pandemic. And while COVID laid bare a lot of inequalities in our society and in every society, it also created a really strange phenomenon where the relationship between nonprofits, the communities that they serve, and their funders was suddenly balanced, right? Because funders suddenly were going through the same thing that we were going through. We were all on lockdown. We were all working with our kids. We were all trying to figure out how to do work in faraway places when we couldn't travel. And the community's role as a protagonist really rose in that time. And plans went out the window, right? Any grant that we had that was structured, that was on XYZ timeline with XYZ deliverables, suddenly had to be shelved. And we approached several of our foundation partners and said, frankly, we can't deliver the project in the way we imagined it. We're all going through the same thing. Will you give us some flexibility to respond to the immediate priorities as the community sees them? And to our surprise, most of our funders said, yes, of course, keep the money, keep working, respond to the priorities, right? What a concept. And so we ran with it, right? And right as COVID hit, 2 huge hurricanes hit Central America. Colorado had its biggest forest fire in its history. Our world was chaos in 2020. We couldn't travel. We were a very location-based organization, and we had to really reframe how we did business, how we ran our organization. And luckily for us, our funders were willing to give us and extend us that flexibility. And when the crisis subsided a little bit, we said, this is actually really working for us. We're able to take it slow, work at the pace of our relationships and the pace of trust, and really engage with community and let them lead on their priorities, right? And we follow their lead. And so can we keep this going? And most of our funders said, yeah, why not? And so we ended up having 5 or 6 funders, maybe just over $500,000 in revenue coming in that was suddenly trust-based, multi-year, unrestricted funding that was responsive to community needs. And so in this really special moment in time, we decided that it was a good time to capture what was happening here, because it was a paradigm shift in how we worked, how we engaged. We started hiring more staff locally, started keeping more staff at home. We opened an office in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We hired staff in Guatemala and Honduras, and consultants throughout the region. We started doing cross-border convenings in the region in Central America, which is a very tough place to operate. But so community could, in the leadership that they were showing on their development challenges, could interact with other communities that were facing the same challenges and talk about solutions, talk about strategy, talk about sharing resources. And it really shifted us as an organization, and we thought we'd capture it with a film. So something else that came up several times today is the power of communication and being able to communicate the importance and relevance of the work that we do in conservation, the data that we collect, et cetera, to a broad audience, right? And TWP also took it upon ourselves in 2020, actually, was the year we started building a real communications team. Because we thought, we do this work on the ground and we invest most of our funds into our programs, but if people don't understand the relevance of it and don't see the impact of the work, they're not going to fund us. We get about 1/3 of our funds from individual donors, maybe 40–45% from foundations any given year, a smattering from corporate partners, and then government, who knows anymore. But in our communications and trying to build a broad base of support from individual donors in all 50 states, we have donors in Europe and Latin America and Canada as well, thank you. We said, we're not investing enough in communications. We had 1 communication staff, and we grew our team to 4 communication staff. We have a Dene filmmaker on our team. We have a Mexican-American filmmaker on our team. That don't need cultural interpretation when they go into communities, and they don't need language interpretation when they go into communities in most cases, right? They can interact because they're from those communities. And right now we're a staff of 16 with 5 tribal nations represented and 7 other countries, mostly in Latin America, represented on our team. And so we're crazy diverse and also really engaged with the places that we work, the people and communities that we serve, and work at the pace of those relationships. So today I'd love to share the trailer for the film. We have a 10-minute film that we produced on trust-based philanthropy, and it features our funders, right? We said we could either present this film as Trees, Water, and People saying, hey, this is what we'd like our foundation relationships to be like, but we said, what if the foundation partners told the story themselves? So we'll show you the 2-minute trailer, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. And then you all can watch it at home tonight or online at twp.org. So there's the cue.
I think that there is a lot of fear in philanthropy around making the wrong grant, about doing something where it could be revealed that this money went the wrong place, it wasn't used the way that it was supposed to be used. And that fear, I think, is what drives the traditional way of grant making.
This work is built on relationships, and that's something that we talk about, in our traditional ways. We sit down, we have meals, we share meals.
It's not necessarily the end product, it's about the process.
And we as natives, we manage our forest areas.
Trust-based philanthropy, I believe we've always had it in our communities. We've always believed in one another to do good work and support each other.
if a funder or philanthropist is interested in addressing a challenge or an opportunity in a community, it must be informed by the people who are experiencing the challenge or the opportunity.
If you trust the organization, why not let them allocate the funds where they want?
It's incredibly beneficial to our program. It allows us to plan years in advance as opposed to constantly sort of scrambling around to secure enough project work and funding.
I guess the best way for me to describe it, you do this work from your heart. And if you do it from your heart, then it expands and extends to everybody that you work with.
Thanks so much. The 10-minute version will knock your socks off if you like that. But yeah, so this conversation today is philanthropy's role in the current state of the world, right? And especially in conservation, and particularly in conservation with indigenous communities. You know, in the US, there's about $1.5 trillion, I think it is, in foundation accounts and endowments. There's $250 billion in donor-advised funds. This is all money that's on the sidelines. About maybe 2% of all of that will go to conservation, right? And in North America, it's probably a smaller percent of that. But with the withdrawal of US and US funds, you know, philanthropy has an opportunity to step in and fill some of the gap. And so the question on the panel today is really how do we want to fill that gap? Right? So love to introduce you all and let you share about your foundations, your works, your perspectives. Lisa, go ahead.
Okay, thanks so much, Sebastian. Thanks to Salazar Center for having this conversation. I think it's a really important one, and if this is anything like the COVID moment, I think we need, you know, to really dig into this because it feels a little bit like that. Okay, so if all of my BFG funder members could just cover their ears for a minute, I want to ask everybody else in the room, how many people have ever written a grant proposal or sought funding from a foundation? Okay, I don't know my glasses. All right, that's enough. So how many people would agree that sometimes there's an inverse proportion to the amount of money you're getting to how onerous the process is? Okay, right, so we can agree on that. All right, so with that sort of principle, I'm going to talk a little bit about my time. I have been in the nonprofit sector, philanthropy, nonprofits, advocacy for almost 30 years, and I have done like all the jobs, right? I was a development director, I run a family foundation that turned into a 501c4, so I did some lobbying in that basis, and now I run the programs for Biodiversity Funders Group, which is a funder, basically a membership organization of mostly private foundations. And in my time in the field, I really have come to believe that you need all of the tools in the toolbox, and trust-based philanthropy is definitely a key part of one of those. When I first started as the CEO, young-ish, at a family foundation, I had trust-based philanthropy kind of in the back of my head, and maybe it wasn't called that at the time, but I was thinking, all right, this is a good way to, you know, build relationships with my brand new portfolio grantees, and I started calling them, and I remember calling one of these kind of charismatic leaders of a Western state-based organization. I said, I really want to be your partner. And he said, I got enough partners, thanks. I thought, okay, well, all right. So that's not the way to approach trust-based philanthropy. You got to actually, like, you know, go and get in there and meet with people. And at the end of the day, you know, he wanted to receive the grant. He didn't really want a hovering, you know, young CEO to go in there and tell him what to do. And that was, you know, in some ways a really good lesson to learn at the early days. So the other thing I will just say at the top here is that, you know, at BFG, you know, that phrase, you meet one foundation, like I feel that on a regular basis. It is really true. It's sometimes really hard to draw parallels between strategies. You know, we spend a lot of time gathering data and doing analysis of what our funders are doing and how they're doing it, and sometimes it's pretty atomized. It's a lot of different things. So in thinking about some of the threads that tie our funders together, the sort of 80+ foundations that I work with regularly, you know, I had a couple of different ways of bubbling that up. So, you know, trust-based philanthropy for me, I think there's some easy takeaways that I think are like no-brainers, right? There's the sort of mechanics of it, right? Okay, let's streamline the grant process. I mean, duh, right? How many more portals do we need to go through? And I do see BFG funders really leaning into that. Oftentimes it's just a letter, sometimes even a conversation. So I'm really proud of those BFG funders that get to that phase. Certainly the elimination of reports. I mean, my God, do we really need an interim report? I don't think that's important. Conversations instead of written reports. Not everybody wants that verbal final report, but at least offering that, I think, is a really great practice that I'm seeing a lot more of. And again, this is not like rocket science. These are the easy things. One of the things when I ran campaign foundations, we did try to put the burden on the program officer to do the homework, do the research, do obviously the due diligence, but also that extra work that's needed that you don't need to put on the grantee, right? To be able to bring your proposal forward to your docket. Not all foundations can do multi-year grants, but certainly that is a good one when you can. And I think one of the things I see a lot in my world is the relationships piece. I think that to me, the people part is one of the sort of best trends that I'm seeing right now in philanthropy, which is, really taking the time to build authentic relationships. I think that happens a little more easily in place-based work, right? You can actually, be in the community, you can go and visit grantees, see projects, spend that time. I know, Angela, that is like sometimes the one best week of everyone's life, and sometimes it puts a burden on the grantee, so really trying to be careful about how that's managed. But that relationships piece, I think that really, I see that more and more, particularly with Indigenous-led work. And at BFG, we lead a tribal-led conservation learning circle with our partners at Native Americans in Philanthropy. I see Jessa Ray here. That's been invaluable for, impressing upon the field just how important that building trust is. And you can't, shortcut those relationships, right? And I think maybe we'll talk about metrics and how to measure success later. And I remember somebody saying, it's like, how many times have you been invited for a cup of coffee in someone's home? Like, why don't we use that as a metric? So yeah, and I think, you talk about this period of time maybe being a crisis where we need to really think about, how do we move money out the door faster? How do we do it better? I didn't touch on general support because I think that's one of the most obvious sort of, levers that trust-based philanthropy, can have in its toolbox. And I think that's one where I'm seeing a little bit less sort of openness to that right now, if I'm honest. I think we call it sort of negotiated general support. And so, yeah, grants get sort of given as general support, but there's a lot of upfront conversation. And I actually don't see that as a bad thing. I think when foundations and grantees and other decision makers can work together and actually, come up with those outcomes together. Obviously, you assume some expertise on the side of the funder, but not me as my 25-year-old brand new CEO, but people who have more seasoned time and understand. I think when you're working toward a policy outcome, if you can do that work together, that is, I think one of the ways, maybe it's a little bit of a twist on trust-based philanthropy, but then you can, make the general support grant, and ideally the grantee gets to determine sort of how to get to those outcomes. Funders now are, I think, recognizing, particularly in the U.S. where I work mostly, that we're in a moment. I mean, we got to really think creatively. I think there's been some disappointment with the field that they're not moving fast enough, and they're not, unleashing more and more of their, their endowments, and they're not raising up above the 5% fast enough. I mean, we definitely see in the BFG community people are starting to do that. I think funders are trying to think of new ways to, work together on their end. So I see a lot of funders aligning around certain projects. A handful of BFG funders have just set up something called the Conservation Capacity Project, which is a pooled fund that will respond just for capacity needs. So if a CEO needs communications training, or there's litigation support needed, technical assistance, just going to be money out the door for that. So pooled funds are becoming more popular. Again, it's not quite in the trust-based philanthropy realm, but it's something where I think thinking about how we can weave in some of those principles might be helpful. BFG's been part of developing something called the U.S. Nature Initiative, and that's an attempt to pick a few focused areas that funders can work together and, try to defend some of the conservation wins of the last several years. And so again, there's more of a relationships theme to that rather than the sort of strict, trust base. But yeah, so, pooling funds, setting up one-stop shops for getting money out the door, it's a little bit of a different flavor, but hopefully these things can work together with trust and, with some of these relationship building strategies, and hopefully that actually gets us somewhere, stronger together. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Ross, do you want to share?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Sebastian, and thanks to the Salazar Center for hosting this conversation. I resonate with a lot of what you said, Lisa, and same with the video just behind me, listening to the people speak about kind of heart-forward granting, learning from process, having pieces in your work kind of grounded in community and some dedicated, intentional listening on what's needed. Those are all pieces that I think it's integral at this moment in time to kind of embody. And for me, I'm a program officer for a private family foundation based here. Our office is just about a 30-minute bus ride from here. And we are very devoted to some of that place-based work. We have our kind of mandate is to support biodiversity and nature protection and promotion here in British Columbia. And with that sort of mission, the areas that we heard that we could be helpful was cultivated in a very crowdsourced, over a cup of coffee, asking the existing people that we're in relationship with, and whether it be grantees or Indigenous leaders and community members or academic experts, is that how can we be helpful? And for us, it's sort of, this is about a few years ago now, we heard, support people, support the pathways towards these outcomes, whether it's, tools, legal, policy, research, knowledge gathering, and place. And I think a piece of some of the philosophy around trust-based philanthropy is you can have those buckets and keep them vague enough for everybody to see themselves and see their work represented in. And so it's been an amazing process implementing those sort of pathways or those sort of streams on how we fund to then see that so many incredible bodies of work lead to biodiversity outcomes in BC. And so I'm excited to kind of get into, just some of the mechanics of how we work, if that's what we want, or some of the stories and lessons. I think we are in a very interesting time, and it does remind me a little bit about that sort of immediately after following the pandemic, there was some really interesting opportunities, I guess, for lack of a better term, that came out of some of that recovery and that economic recovery pieces and some stimulus actions from the province that led to some real conservation outcomes and human well-being outcomes, knowing that they're intrinsically tied. So it's been really fascinating, and we hold a lot of gratitude to a lot of our grantees for teaching us how to do the good funder work. And so, happy to dig into more of this as we go.
So another point that really stuck out to me today was involving community in defining success, right? And having contextually relevant measures of outcomes. And so I think the big elephant in the room with trust-based philanthropy is, well, how do you know that you've created impact, right? And I think exploring those notions of impact, actually it was one of our grantees. So we're an intermediary organization. We kind of play the role between the funder and several small grassroots organizations throughout Central America and Mexico and the American Southwest. And they actually came back to us and they said, this community in Honduras that we've worked with for quite some time, place-based community on the edge of the capital city were losing their traditional homelands, their ancestral homelands, to development and growth of the city, and they were working on protecting the last chunk of forest that they had left, which was under attack by developers and mineral extractors and migrants from other rural parts of the country that were coming in and taking down forests to farm. And we had a grant where we were measuring things done per dollar, right? We were measuring numbers of trees and survival rates and growth rates and everything. And they came to us and they said, this is taking so much of our time when what we're really trying to do is protect this entire mountain permanently. And we said, wow, we're going about this the totally wrong way. So we went back to the funder and said, the impact that the community's trying to create is really measured generationally. They want to leave this protected for future generations, and we're, making them count trees and volunteers and acres treated and everything. So this notion of impact is really complex, and so I'd just like to hear, how do you all look at impact in terms of in conservation work, and what's a successful outcome versus a fall short outcome in community-based conservation?
I think I'd be remiss if I didn't refer to Stephanie one more time in this panel discussion, but having worked with our friends in the Biden administration, the word that comes up for me is durability. And I think, if you don't do that work in the community that obviously depends on trust, depends on relationship building, you're gonna see all those executive orders just flip back the other way when the new guy comes in. So to me, and this is a tough thing right now, but how, when so many fires are burning, so many things we need to actually put out that are urgent, how do we actually build toward a long-term future, right? Like, what is the building we should be doing now that's 10 years out, 15, 20 years out? And I mean, those are hard interim metrics to come up with, right? Is it trees, or is it that you've had, some sort of relationship type metric? So I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that if you want things to stick, it does feel like you got to look out, and the relationship piece is really key to that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we try to hold a lot of different things in our hands. We see the political window in the province and up until now, and we'll see, but federally as well, that there's a lot of hay to be made, and that movements and commitments around 30 by 30 are powerful tools, potentially, and so there is the sort of grander metrics there, but what we try to focus on, where we, pulling elements from trust-based philanthropy or relational philanthropy is, we really rely on our grantees or our partners to tell us what they're measuring. So part of our application process, we've tried to remove as many barriers as possible, get people to just reuse applications they're using for somewhere else. A lot of the time, I will just go in, based on a conversation, I'll go in and try to fill out an application myself, since I'm the one with dedicated capacity compared to maybe a community member with many hats, and part of that is asking how they're measuring success, or what success looks like to them, or what progress looks like. And so it might, we talked about cups of coffee, but that legitimately might be a piece where there is a community outreach element needed to socialize the idea, say, of an Indigenous protected and conserved area in community, or even days on the water harvesting, spawn-on kelp on the coast here, or number of members and sign-ups for mobilization online to get some provincial policy piece across the line. So, number of different things, and they kind of all come through. The hairy thing for us is trying to, put all that together in a way that feels good for us at the end of, some strategic framework cycle that we have internally, but that's not really what we're concerned about. I think we focus on those relationships and those pieces that are meaningful to community, and if we're in connection there, and if things feel good, then usually there's a lot of alignment and inspiration comes from that to continue the work. But we certainly have our eye on the sort of durability and protection in perpetuity that comes from strong kind of local governance. And I think especially in a time right now where there is a lot of uncertainty in a state law sense and federal and provincial level here, power is local, and I think that's makes it all the more important to listen to on the ground what folks are measuring their success by.
That's great. I really like the coffee cup index of, we got a couple more. Right. Because that's real, a lot of the work that happened during that period of 2020 to 2023 when we were working with this community, and yes, we did get a law passed through Honduran Congress and got a protected area, a national wildlife refuge established on the edge of Tegucigalpa, 12,600 acres, about 50 square kilometers. Proportionally to Canada, I did the math, it's about 5,000 square kilometers. Honduras is a tiny little country. So yeah, that's a durable outcome, but a lot of the process was a lot of meetings, a lot of trust building, a lot of relationship building with government actors. And in New Mexico, a similar process where we worked with the U.S. Forest Service and signed an agreement with them and 3 tribes that border the Santa Fe National Forest for tribes to be able to do restoration work uphill beyond their tribal boundaries on the public lands and ancestral lands. But, if we had been submitting quarterly reports, it would have looked like a lot of nothing was going on, right? And so getting past that, I think, do you have any suggestions for how we can talk about those processes with funders that might not be there yet, so that they can see the value in that process?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, and it brings to mind a really interesting process that I think really embodies a paradigm shift mentality. There is, and it reminded me when you mentioned kind of a capacity fund, Lisa, it's a few iterations, but what used to be an Indigenous capacity fund, but fast forward a bunch of years, there's a fund here in the province, not in the province, but held an Indigenous-led fund called the Right Relations Collaborative, and it really flips the power dynamic of funder and community practitioner or actor. Funders, institutional funders, have to apply to be a part and a member of the Right Relations Collaborative. And there's obviously a granting commitment that goes along with that. And then there's a circle of aunties made up of these 3 Indigenous leaders that choose and disperse and identify where that funding goes to community in the province. So it's been a really a privilege to be a part of that. Sitka is a member of the Right Relations Collaborative, and we've had a ton of learning just how to show up and how to be a good partner. And it's been really cool to flip that process on its head and be the one for us as the applicant in a way. So that's been a really valuable process. And I think it's a model that in terms of Indigenous-led conservation, globally, it would be really powerful to see that exercised more.
It's a very substantive example. I was just going to say something more generic, but just the learning spaces are so key. It sometimes feels like a luxury to be able to come to something like this, but it is where the field grows, right? These are places where things do, the ball gets advanced down the field. So I would just say, in terms of my role at BFG, just continuing to try to open that aperture of what is acceptable, or what are emerging practices, what are different ways to do things. So.
I want to talk about this notion of well-being, right? One of our strategic pillars is helping create influential organizations, right? Because power is local, especially when that macro power withdraws, the grassroots network keep going. And so, I'm trying to create a linkage between, if we have healthy organizations, that is going to lead to healthy, durable impact. And to have healthy organizations, you need to have well-being among staff. So part of trust-based philanthropy, I think, for us, was being able to disregard the notion of 20% overhead, right? Putting that to bed and saying, you know, we have to invest in the well-being of our staff to run a good operation, because if they can't make ends meet as they're trying to serve others, we're not going to do a good job. So, you know, beyond general operating support, are there any examples from your work of investing in the well-being of the organizations that you're serving?
Some of the things I've seen among funders are just, yeah, besides the general operating, but supporting, coaching for emerging CEOs, right? I think that's a place where, you know, you see a lot in the green organizations in the U.S., a huge leadership change, right? A lot of new leaders. So, you know, giving them the support that they need, and obviously they get to decide what that is, but actually giving, you know, flexible dollars for that. Supporting conferences, places for NGOs to get together. I see that a lot in the BFG space. And then with this new capacity building fund, I have a sense that there is a desire to actually invest in, you know, more of the soft stuff, right? I mean, I hate to say it that way, but just the sort of, you know, retreats and things like that that might feel like luxuries, but right now are super, super important.
Yeah, I'll echo that. We've supported a few convenings where, in recent years, where just the point is for a celebration of some of these pieces, because there's been some incredible outcomes in the last few years here in British Columbia and across Canada. You know, we have the leaders from the 4 PFPs here today, and that work over the last 3 years, I mean, 3 years alone, but it's been, you know, decades. But these are incredible moments that have happened for some of these communities. And back to some of the work in BC, you know, there's been some incredible watershed achievements as well, and just having allowing time and space for some of our grantees that have their head in it for so long to come up for air and just pause and have celebration and be in community together is great. I think we're also constantly, when I'm connecting with folks, like a lot of our grantees are in the room here as well, connecting and just asking kind of what can we do. A lot of the time we're invited to also use our social capital to relieve burden or take on, you know, bits of outreach or fundraising connection or something when it makes sense and when it feels good for them. And so that's been an invitation that we've been kind of, happy to accept and help with. There is pieces around 2021, 2022, we were seeing a lot of heavy inflation that was really affecting a lot of the budgets in our grantees. And so one piece that our board and ED championed was at midway points in a lot of our multi-year grants, inviting folks to take a look of adjusting pledges and multi-year grants to account for inflation. And I think that was really appreciated and felt a little bit different than how some other institutional transactional funding relationships have happened in the past. So we got, as you could imagine, got a lot of uptake from that, and it landed well with folks that just have extra cushions in tough contexts. Yeah.
That's great. Well, we have about 9 minutes left. I wanted to see if there's anything popping up on that iPad of questions from the audience, just to make sure we have. Oh, she pressed the button. All right. All right, the first one, it says, in the U.S., the federal government is reducing or eliminating funding for climate equity and conservation. Can philanthropy fill that gap? The answer is no. All right. The scale is just a tremendous, it's an order of magnitude at least, I think. But, I think that if we work more efficiently and take friction out of the process, I think that those funds can go further. Anything you want to add on those?
Yeah, I would like to add that this is a good time to think about rebuilding our advocacy and lobbying muscle, right? I think COVID diminished that a bit. I'm not speaking for all NGOs. Some have been going super strong ever since, but if advocacy and getting up there on the Hill if you work in DC has anything to do with those dollars, and even in a good administration, this is the time to be thinking about that again. I think we are diminished, and sort of building that back up would be a good use of leveraging dollars, in my opinion.
I think you covered it well, Jan. Nothing to add?
Yeah, the related, how can we unlock the funds in endowments, and should we?
Shame? Maybe, no, that's probably not a good strategy. I mean, some funders are starting. I feel like, funders are, okay, again, BFG members, cover your ears, but kind of conservative, like lowercase c, right? A lot of risk, right? Some are great taking risks, but some don't. And so you do need a few of the bigger ones that are more secure to, be able to go out there and set the pace on things like that. So I do see, MacArthur is doing that in our space. I'm sure there will be some others to come, but, and those, got to get those lawyers talking to each other. And like, we don't, BFG, we don't have a lot of interaction from trustees and boards, but occasionally, and I feel like we could do a better job at finding paths for board members and trustees and that, general counsel to sort of talk to each other. I think Hewlett Foundation's doing a little bit of that work with, foundation lawyers, and just sort of unlocking some of those myths, some of those things that make funders sort of like retrench and get a little less risky.
My brain actually goes to swimming upstream a little bit on that. There is a lot of our Indigenous partners that we grant to for some of their Indigenous protected and conserved area work that have established endowments and are having a hard time getting institutional funders and philanthropy and other sources of finances to interact with it, and to kind of, because there's certainly a relinquishing of power and direction and control when you grant into and place fundings and do endowment. But that's critical work. That's how a lot of the stewardship activities get operationalized each year. And so I think that's another piece that needs to be a bit more socialized in the funding space.
Of, is this a good idea? I mean, if there wasn't ever a good time to sort of spend a little more money, I mean, I don't know what that would be, but it feels like now's a good time.
Yeah, and so private foundations have to give 5% of their corpus a year to be legally compliant. I think donor advised funds, they don't have a minimum, but they give it a higher rate. That's a private philanthropic vehicle used by individuals and more increasingly organizations. Instead of creating a family foundation, a lot are opting for donor advised funds that are difficult because they don't necessarily have a web page, they don't have an application process. It's really, it's who you know and who knows you. There's a great nonprofit funding author named Kevin Brown who put out a book called Being Findable and Fundable. That's really insightful reading of just helping nonprofits think about how to access those hidden pools of capital. And a lot of it is about how are you making yourself findable to audiences that you don't even know exist. And you may never know exist. It could just be anonymous, but that's really good. Lots of questions coming in. So this one I liked. Trust-based philanthropy is not unconditional love. What do you think of the terms limits, and does trust but verify approach count and feel okay? So full disclosure, I'll just start. Trust-based philanthropy project that kind of started and put language to this term doesn't want to use the term. They just want philanthropy to operate in this way, right? So that was one of the great insights from that interview with Shadi Salehi from the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. She's like, we don't even want this to be called Trust-Based Philanthropy. It just kind of caught on and took off, and I think it was important as an organizing concept, but we're just talking about how can we make relationships better between foundations and organizations and communities. But what do you all think about Trust But Verify?
Can we change it today? Can this be the day that we call it relationship-based philanthropy? Yeah, I mean, Trust But Verify sounds kind of funny just because I feel like the due diligence process and the work the program officers have to do, that's the verifying, right? So that's sort of baked in. Yeah, I think if we pull the ingredients out of it, right, then let's just do that, right? I think that's, and then people can, maybe it's a menu of things. If you're not able to do them all, you at least have some ability to pick off some things and not feel like, oh my God, I'm failing at it, right? But I don't know, you're more steeped in this. What do you think?
No, I would totally agree. I think there's lots of ingredients in the recipe, and yeah, I don't see the need to call it trust-based philanthropy either. I think it's, as you mentioned, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation, and so it's different for everybody, and I think it's kind of whatever feels good and feels right in your area of work. And I think being in the nature of a nature funder, we're not, if I'm doing a little gardening project in my, backyard, which is like the size of a picnic blanket, that's great. I can do that, but I'm not going to pretend to, have all the answers on the ground in the rest of the province, right? So we need to have our partners kind of let us know what that is. And so I don't really know how you would do this type of work in a meaningful way that promotes healthy biodiversity and healthy communities without the ingredients that we're kind of talking about here. And we're really heartened to see how normalized a lot of this stuff is, and how much of an anomaly the more kind of top-down strategic philanthropy is of a bygone era. However, having said that, we still have reporting and we still have accountability, both to our board, but more so also to our ground on the partners. And so, yeah, I think there's elements of it that can be taken and applied across the board.
All right, rather than get into there's a lot of deep questions here, and we have about a minute left. What's bringing you hope or joy these days?
Yeah, I think, just quickly, I think some of the power and effective change in the past few years on some of these, you wouldn't even call them conservation, just different tools to hold up and amplify Indigenous sovereignty and authority. And it could be language revitalization or presence on the land or whatever, but we're seeing real change here in British Columbia, and I hope that people are watching, and I hope that those voices are heard and those stories are told. And I have the unearned privilege to hear a few of them. And so, yeah, if folks want some stories about what's been transformational, there's a lot of hope lies in there. So, thanks.
Yeah, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting next to you and we're here in BC, but there is a lot to learn from BC, and it is very inspiring, and I think a lot of funders in the U.S. are taking some of those lessons. So that's on my mind. But I also think this is a time when you're faced with adversity. It is a time to get together, take a fresh look at things, get rid of old labels, don't worry about hierarchy. Really, everybody can kind of get together and think about the new way we want to do this work. And I feel energized by that. There is a lot of energy in philanthropy to take a fresh look, think more expansively about what types of grantees, how you want to fund, move money faster. That feels exciting to me and hopeful.
I can't top that. So thank you all very much, and thank you too. This was a great session.